Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Q&A for the Red Book. And Jeremy is here, and he's aggregated some questions for me from Patreon. I really appreciate all those. Like I said, I will try and get some from YouTube if I can make it through all the Patreon questions, but we're getting such great ones from Patreon. I just fill in the time. So thank you, Jeremy, and let's get rolling.
Hey, Wes. So starting with Red Book, the first questions were about whether Jung was having a midlife crisis, a mental health breakdown, kind of like right away, just what's going on here? This is crazy. So Tina says, wow, what can I say? I feel as though I stumbled into a crazed, drug-induced dream of a person who's undergoing a severe life crisis. Obviously, he states that he is middle-aged and has reached many successful milestones in his life, and yet there seems to be a deep fissure. The phrase that haunts me is, "It is no teaching and no instruction I give you. On what basis should I presume to teach you? My path is not your path, therefore I cannot teach you. The way is within us." So was Jung going through a mental health breakdown or a midlife crisis?
Yes to all the above, which he says, right? He actually says it in the Red Book. A doctor would say I was crazy, and I should know because I'm a psychiatric doctor. Right? In almost so many words, he articulates this pretty clearly. Mm-hmm. And I think but not just because lots of people have had midlife crises and they aren't Jung, right? So this is one of the things. So it's better when he has one than when most of us have one, I would say. But a big distinction I'd like to be here is he did like he said, I had everything that somebody could want, right? I had wealth, I had fame, I had position, I had achieved, within his society, he had done, he had checked all the boxes. He got the gold star. He was winning, and he just turned to ashes, right? He did not care. The disturbance of World War I is profound. The kind of social and political upheaval leading up to the war and then the war, of course, deeply, deeply upset, obviously many people, Jung included. But another part of this is, I think he felt, I don't think he articulates this, that he really did feel like he was doing an injustice to himself and that he wanted to transform himself. Mm-hmm. And so this is a catalog, a journey, a diary. But remember, this is edited. It's selected from his diary. So it's not just, like a real-time unedited stream of consciousness event, even though it feels like that at times. It is constructed to try and communicate what happened to him when he I think maybe the best way to think of it is he trying to communicate what happened to him when he took his midlife crisis and said, right, I'm going to take this crisis and I'm going to go right into it. I'm going to go as far into this crisis as I can. I'm not trying to overcome it or weather it. I'm going to just try to swallow it. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a very different response to a midlife crisis, I think. But it is the product of severe, midlife crisis. I think it's a good word for it.
Yeah, and Robert says, was Jung having a mental health episode when he wrote these passages? So there's a big difference between having a midlife crisis and having a mental health breakdown. So do you have a sense of, was he in trouble or was it more like a midlife crisis?
So, again, I'm trying to diagnose. I don't think he was having a mental breakdown, but I do think he went about as far as you can go into yourself without having a mental breakdown, right? He wanted to know why. Like, why am I having a midlife crisis? Speaking of the, what is going on? I'm not going to try to, paper it over. I'm not going to try and make some incidental change in my life. I'm going all the way in, and I'm going to try and find out what's in there, and then I'm going to face it right on this as honestly and as directly as I can. And it's the record of that venture, but it does feel like madness at times. That's for sure.
Chemistry Mickey says, perhaps I'm just jaded from my own hallucinations and dreams, but thus far, Jung doesn't seem that crazy. Unusual and orthodox, sure. Bonkers, it doesn't seem like it. I look forward to seeing how the ideas flow and any through line that's apparent.
Yeah, so I would say I don't think it seems that crazy in the visions, but I do think it is quite crazy in the text that he's able to produce from them. Because there are a lot of texts where people record their visions and they go, oh, I took drugs, or I went to the mountain, or I had these visions. And they kind of give you this narrative. And the narrative is crazy within this context of coherence and, structural order. And Jung really seems to be trying to use the Red Book to break that down. Like, I'm not going to give you the pieces that let this assemble. It doesn't form a puzzle. There isn't an opening where it's like, oh, I took the drugs and then, oh, this crazy stuff happened to me. And then I came down and then this is what I did with them. See what I'm saying? And so I think in some ways, it's not the visions that I feel is so much crazy as that his attempt to create this very different sort of literary work that is, I think, more impressive, right? And his meditations on that, I would say. So
very original, and in that sense, sort of crazy. Yeah. Daniel was comparing Jung to other artists that kind of remind him of him. He says, I'm texting tonight after too much wine, and I'm reminiscing about Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and Rudy Wurlitzer's Nog, Antonin Artaud, and also Dada, just like the art movement. Do you have comparisons of other literature art to Jung?
So this is where I struggle, and why I think why this book is so interesting is he pushes the levels of incoherence, but then he tries to bring it back. He's trying to say he is making an argument, but the way he's making it is in the text, like Joyce. I think something like Joyce, where the incoherence of the text is part of what he's trying to achieve, and that sort of element, that sort of trying to get us to think differently. There are a few works that do this in different ways, but they're pretty rare. And so Jung is clearly trying to lead us down a path with him, so that we can kind of experience with him what he was happening to him and why and what it means, without just like making a list and making a rational argument and all the things that he knew how to do and that he was really comfortable with doing, because he had that training. So he's both for himself trying to liberate his mind from that, and then trying to give a sort of a here's a way we can maybe all liberate our minds from this. But notice he never actually says what he's doing. So it's not like a user manual, like, oh, meditate this way and take these drugs and go to this mountain and then have this experience. It's like, oh, yeah. So it's kind of different. The easier one that I can think of is in The Name of the Rose, which is the big book. Now, who wrote that? Umberto Eco. And he says that the point of The Name of the Rose was to educate you into being the kind of person who could read The Name of the Rose. And I had read it originally and thought, wow, this is an amazing book, but it's so strange in so many ways. But the narrative kind of tricks you into not noticing what a weird book it is. And then when I read that comment from him and I went back and reread The Name of the Rose, I was like, oh, he's basically indoctrinating you into medieval theology. And so you end up, and by the way, part of the proof of this is it's a murder mystery where you never find out what happens. It's never solved, and most people don't care. Most people don't even notice that they've just read a 600-page or 400-page murder mystery. They never find out who did the killings. They never actually know what was happening, and yet no one cares because they're just involved in the theology. They're like, oh, I've become a scholastic monk in the 14th century. I forgot all about the murder mystery. That was so long ago. So I think it's more of a work that structures that way. And Dadaism, these other works that try to break us out of our normal mode of thinking, that is a good comparison.
Jack comes up with an idea, some language that he calls Jung's way of thinking about things, dynamic thinking versus rational thinking. And he says, as you were talking about institutions over relying on scientific or rational thinking, and the tendency to systematize, I started to wonder if this pattern reflects a sort of increasing complexity and increasing specialization in the world. Say what you want about scientific thinking, but its attempts to lay context and assumptions out clearly and to boil truths down to be persuasive to many people who may be scattered or not share your context. With something more dynamic and idiosyncratic like Jung, the amount of effort that it takes to sync context, to understand what it is he's even on about, might limit his reach. The soul-crushing nature of systematizing works the same. The idea is to make something simple enough to replicate by many people who don't have to put as much work into truly understanding the framework in exchange for taking the play and humanity out of it. So is there this back and forth between kind of like a trade-off with thinking rationally and systematizing versus this kind of more dynamic thinking?
Yeah, there is a tension, and you do get benefits from both. But I think part of the problem is, and this is kind of back to the other series, House of the Intellect, is we've decided that the one way is right and the other way is wrong. This is fundamentally it's where we are. And what's hilarious about this is, so science has become so specialized that now, like, scientists don't know what other scientists are doing. It's not like scientists can communicate to each other. Only specialists can communicate with specialists. And so how do you know if you're a non-specialist, whether a specialist is doing a good job and you need to hire them or promote them? Well, you have to ask somebody who knows. So now you've moved from a scientific model to a trust human model. You're just like, that person's opinion seems valuable. I'll ask them, how do I know their opinion is valuable? Because I can't read their articles. But they've got a lot of stars and stamps that say they're valuable. So right. So you're back to this weird sort of, again, medieval model where status, position, authority is theoretically underwritten by this specialized knowledge. However, the use of it and the distribution of it really is simply interpersonal, and which the humanities are emphasized. And so we pretend like that isn't this crucial element. We pretend like we're going to make decisions at some level, whether investment decisions or research decisions or political decisions based on the facts. And if we have the facts, by the way, this is a widely critiqued problem with the Enlightenment philosophy, is just if we just have the facts, then. But it turns out when you try to look at the facts, often you end up with judgment calls. Mm-hmm. And it's like, actually, it's Alfred North Whitehead, I believe, in his Science, That Glorious Entertainment, says, you have a problem like fluoride in the water, which was brand new then. And they go, the scientists say it'll work, and some say it's not. And he said, this isn't a scientific question. This is an ethical question. Is it okay to run this experiment on millions of people who don't know what's happening to them? It's an ethical question, not a scientific question. It's not a question whether it helps them or not. You're making the ethical argument is that we can put chemicals in people's water that they don't know what it is and they don't know what's going to do, but we don't care. We don't have to ask them. We know it's best for them. Right? That's a very problematic ethical and philosophical problem, not a scientific problem.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so what happens is we pretended like the better we get at science and math and technology, the less we have to have these ethical problems. Like we just don't have to think of that way anymore. The decisions aren't based on that. It turns out that, they never go away. They're always there. And so when you don't have access to that, you can't do the counterbalance. It's not that you want to get rid of the other, but it's just that it's now gotten to a place where there's just no, there's no counterbalancing.
Mm-hmm. Robert noticed in your Red Book lecture that you had said at some point that our ancestors didn't have meaning available to them as an idea. And I didn't catch that. I maybe he misheard it, or maybe I just didn't hear it. But Robert's question is, if our ancestors didn't have meaning available to them as an idea, when did that idea begin to develop? And how do we know that the concept of meaning was unavailable to them, and why did meaning win?
Ooh, so I'm not sure. Did I say that our ancestors? And I'm trying to think what I might have meant by saying our ancestors did not have meaning. Oh, if you could get me that passage where I said that, I would love to know. Not you, the person.
Robert, yeah.
Robert, if you're listening to this, please, put a citation from me in there, because I could have misspoken, because I don't think of our ancestors as not having meaning. So, I may have meant that they didn't have this, like images, context, concepts, words don't have the same meaning that we give them now, right? So obviously, how things resonate and mean today is not what they used to mean in the past, but it doesn't sound like I'm answering that question. So rather than waffle on and guess, I will say I'm not sure I grasp that one, but I would love to understand that question. So please, if you can find the passage, if that's not too much of a pain, and I'll look for it too, then I would love to answer that, because now I'm really thinking about what it would mean for our ancestors not to have access to meaning.
Yeah, or the idea of meaning.
Yeah, the idea of, and I feel like, we're in a Heidegger book.
Yeah,
We've lost the idea of meaning somewhere.
Yeah, we'll answer it in the next Q&A.
Okay. Yeah.
So Jack says, I've really been enjoying the Red Book so far, and I wonder if the appeal of the Red Book and Thus Spake Zarathustra is sort of like a directional inspiration for people who tend to over-intellectualize, over-analyze, and overthink things. There is a sense of peace and freedom that you get from reading these wacky works from people who are clearly very strong thinkers, but who choose to write more associatively to better express their humanity. If I weren't confident that there was something real in the Red Book, I don't think I'd be having nearly as good a time with it. I feel like I've seen mystical or spiritual writings in this vein before, and my reaction then was to be extremely irritated with the lack of rigor. So, I thought that was an interesting comment. Yeah,
and this is great, because it's a good question. It made me think all of a sudden, like, would I have ever read this if it wasn't from Jung? And so he does have that aura of important thinker, and I'm like, okay, so I'll take it seriously. Like, if this was from, Bob, I would I have gone, oh yeah, I think I'm this guy's doing amazing work. It's hard to know, but it's a very good point, and I think yes. But I also think I've read a lot of mystical texts. I just an embarrassing amount. Partly, if you're reading medieval scholastic texts, you're doomed. You're just absolutely doomed to this crap. And Jung does set himself apart from just the sort of mystical waffling. And in that, notice he keeps shifting modes from, I had this image, I kind of think this might be this image, means, I'm probably just misinterpreting myself and hiding from myself. Okay, I need to go back in. But I do think it does give a model. I like this language of directionality. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it says, hey, you could go this direction. Like, not all thinking is rational. A lot of our thinking is, the example or metaphor I keep using is musical, right? It's not rational that music affects us the way it does, but it does. Pre-linguistic, right? Music just hits us someplace else. And we can say, oh, well, music doesn't really affect my feelings. But I think for most people, that would be a lie. But if you say, well, why does it make me feel that way? It's like, oh, well, like, this is going to be really subjective. So here is a field of subjective emotional and intellectual response to something that's ubiquitous, music, that either we're not supposed to think about because there's no real rational, like, scientific way to go through this. Although, if you've ever played on the piano, if you go through all the chords, all the keys, if you play the keys and all the scales, you start to feel the shift in mood. Right? They do feel different keys sort of have this different vibe, right? You're like, oh, that's a different vibe. That's a different vibe, but it's not scientific, right? That this key has a different vibe is not really a testable or not testable,
right?
I imagine, but yeah. So can we think musically, or do we just have to think rationally? And for the first several thousand years of human history, this was not a question. Of course, we could think musically. But then all of a sudden, with the dominance of science and the scientific method, because it's so successful, by the way, this is why I don't want to say it doesn't work. It's so spectacularly successful that it makes it seem like this other way of thinking is no good, even though, of course, this is an extraordinarily human way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy asks a question about the image in Jung. And he says, Jung's reflection on the primacy of images reminds me of the filmmaker Herzog's opinion that our society has no adequate images anymore to express ourselves or our civilization. And he says, I feel this all the more in the case of the modern digital world where images are being consumed quickly and instantly without contemplation. And he goes on to talk about a late Polish painter who would make images and then refuse to talk about them or give any analysis of them because he felt like the image itself would speak louder than any explanation he could give. And like Jung, he didn't want to commit murder via explanation.
Yeah. So the primacy of the image. I mean, we are visual animals. Hence, like it said, digital media. What happens when a visual animal is inundated with images? We're running that experiment. It doesn't seem to be that helpful.
Mm-hmm.
All I can recommend for somebody is experiments. I love to run experiments on myself. Is if you'll put yourself into an environment where the visual stimulation is very low, very constrained, and very cool, it does tend to settle the mind a lot. Wow, it's amazing how calming it feels to be in low visually stimulus environments. And then when you go to a high stimulus environment, it's like, bang, it just hits you.
Mm-hmm.
And so being more careful and caring more about the visual stimulation that we receive, I think is important in that because we have dreams tend to be strongly visual, right? There might be sound. I don't know if do people smell in dreams? I'm trying to think if I've ever had a smell in a dream. They certainly have emotional, but they, the primacy of the visual is so strong, and it's indeed to the point of overwhelming, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So the other notion is also makes me think of abstract painting. So I think people get this wrong about that because they say, oh, abstract painting is not real painting or da-da-da. And it's like, because it's not representational. And it's like, oh, but think of it with an abstract artwork, painting, sculpture, or whatever, all you get is the thing itself, das Dinge, as the Germans would say. And that's what we struggle with, right? When what we have is just the thing,
Mm-hmm.
with no narrative, with no painter telling us what it means, it's sort of like we don't know what to do with it. Like, no, I don't like that thing that doesn't tell me what it means, because then I'm just stuck with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does highlight the degree to which not only are we over visually stimulated, but to the degree to which we're overstimulated with the narratives that have come up with those with images, whether we want them to or not. Right? Like just an image can suggest so much because it's already packed in. It's like punching a button that plays a loop in our head. And this image plays a loop, and that image plays a loop, and that image plays a loop, and it's all just built in. Dang, dang, bang. This is what filmmakers do a lot of, right? They just exploit all these things that we're big guy in a black cape and a dark voice, bad guy,
Mm-hmm.
good guy, white cape, right? It's just these just visual narratives that we're trapped in. So yeah, I think the primacy of image is important to ponder. And so what Jung does is he goes to the lake and tries to sort of get all that out of his mind and get back to whatever, the proto images, which he claimed. I'm still not sure I believe it, but this notion that there are certain images that are just in us when we're born, and that if we can get back to those and experience those and surround ourselves with those, that it will create a better and richer environment.
Marcia asks a question that compares Jung to Kant. And she says, how does one express the inexpressible? Perhaps Jung was encountering what Kant described as the noumenal.
Yes.
It sounds like Jung experienced what we call madness, but how mad is our own consensus, our consensus reality? So, was there a connection between these two, Kant's noumenal?
Not direct connection, as far as I know. I mean, Jung was widely read, but I don't think he was hugely influenced by Kant. But so he probably had encountered this idea. I would say the stronger resonance there is, oddly, Kant wrote, and I want to get the passage right. That the only two things that really inspired him, something like this, was reflecting on man's moral self. This made him feel the overwhelming presence of God. And looking at the sky at night filled with stars. Right? And that the vast unknowability and incomprehensibility of that always made him feel spectacular and gave him a sense of life and of everything else. And so even Kant, right, the sort of argument logical guy, really did have this other side where he's like, oh, it's the encounter with the ineffability of the night sky that really freed his soul and inspired him. And that sensibility, I think, is where Jung is, right? Like he's having these encounters that are inspiring him and filling him with this need. Not in of course, with Kant, it's going to be this cold, clear, overwhelming sense of the vacuum and massiveness of space, right? Like, because that's just how if you've read a lot of Kant, you're like, yeah, that's his mind. But for Jung, it's clearly this encounter with the inside, with that self that he just overwhelms, that noumena that inspires and fills, but can't be articulated. So yeah, that to me was what resonates from Kant with Jung.
And recently, you've re-released some older lectures on Nietzsche and on Marx with improved audio, and these are from a long time ago, like 10 years ago or more. And there are a couple questions on those lectures as well. On the Nietzsche lecture, Jeremy says, "Thanks, Wes. This was a great listen. There are parts of Nietzsche that really resonate with me, i.e., the need to find one's own values and to get back to them, even if they're different from the world's. But I bounce off him a little bit because he can seem a bit heartless to the plight of others." Question: does he ever talk about compassion? Would it be a virtue to him, or would he see it as a remnant of slave morality?
Yeah, and this is I think it's great. If you read Nietzsche and don't struggle, then I'm going to be concerned, right? Like this is, so I say, I think that's a healthy sign of your intellectual development there. Yeah, what's interesting is I'm trying to think if he speaks well of compassion ever. And one of the things that warped his thinking is he was so Christianity. He was so enmeshed in a society like Jung, by the way, that was so heavily Christian indoctrinated that it drove him mad. And so he just lashed out at it at times, overemphasizing that, right? It did warp his thinking in places, and that's just hard to avoid. But I don't think he ever spoke of compassion. But interpersonally, he was known to be a very, perhaps even overly kind and compassionate person, right? So a lot of this is ego projection, if you will, thinking of Jung, where he wanted to be this person who could overcome this, but basically like just really a decent guy. Like he really wanted to be helpful. He wanted to have friends. He didn't want there to be suffering in the world, right? And so there is this frisson between like, we've got to overcome all this and other people suffering, and it's got nothing to do with us, and his personal one. But yeah, I definitely think that's a place where you pause and go, really, couldn't we? And also notice he almost never talks about anything communal. He is. Right. He is very suspicious of and felt the press of other people very strongly. And so his sense of community is just almost non-existent.
And Jeremy follows up and says, I've heard people describe that parts of our world could be described as a cultural battle between Nietzschean philosophy and Christian philosophy, rugged individualism versus compassionate togetherness. Do you think this analysis is meaningful?
Well, if Christian compassion were a driving force in contemporary society, I would say yes, but I don't feel that, particularly in American society. It's not that. That's not the part of Christianity that's been emphasized. It's again the more Calvinist suffering, work hard, do what you're told version of Christianity that has really taken over and taken hold and informs the society. It's sort of the St. Francis of Assisi debate: feed the poor, feed the hungry, clothe the needy, get rid of wealth. That, he's nowhere. Functionally, where do you ever see him?
Mhm.
Right? That is maybe around a little bit, but it's not. And the elements of feeding the poor and welfare state that has grown up in the last couple of hundred years is an outgrowth of a lot of movements, including Marx. Speaking of the other lecture, not necessarily associated with that. Although socialism, pre-Marx, in its early days, was heavily influenced by Christian ideals, but those are not the ideals of Christianity that seems to have stuck around outside of socialism. So,
Right. And Jeremy asks a question about Marx. He says, what frustrates me is how capitalism has waged and thus far won the ideological war for being the most moral possible system, quote, a rising tide lifts all boats and all that. Apparently, all one has to do is repeat the words Stalin and Mao again and again, and for some people, the argument is over. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. There are certain debates that almost can't be had most of the time, and so to try and have an informed discussion with somebody about the potential merits of communism are virtually impossible, I would say, in almost any setting, because of this. They go, oh well, it's Stalin and Mao, and they were horrible. Their systems were horrible, and that ipso facto communism is horrible. And you can go, okay, the question is communism necessarily lean that way? I mean, there are all kinds of reasons I think communism is a bad idea, but Stalin and Mao, I don't think are necessary representatives of that.
Right.
So, it is a shorthand and unhelpful version of why arguing against communism. And ipso facto, they say, oh, this is when you try to criticize capitalism. People say, oh, well, what do you want? Communism? You want to work for Mao? You want to be in a factory in Stalinist Russia? It's like, I'd like to think there's more choices than that. Like, these are not the only two. If we look at all of human history, are those the only two things that have ever existed? Answer, no, of course, obviously not. But again, it's almost impossible to have this debate, which I think is unfortunate. And it's, when I did my Marx lecture, I think I say in there, I hope I said in there, is that he was so good at so much of the critiquing that he did, and so terrible was then what should happen, right? Like but his critiques are so spot on and they so hold up. But now he's been tarred with the brush of Marxism, right? So Marx wasn't a Marxist because, of course, he created Marxism. He created something that people then retroactively call that, and it's like, oh, but there's a lot good there that gets thrown out with the sort of cultural and historical interpretation. But yeah, that's an ongoing frustration. But I don't even know. Yeah, I don't. You just can't. It's almost unhavable, that discussion. Although, oddly, in France, the Communist Party, and they are communists, they are like get rid of all private property communists, still gets a fair number of votes. They're still going concern. They're in parliament. You're like, wow, that's not America.
Well, thank you to our Patreon listeners and YouTube listeners, and for all the questions. And thank you, Wes.
Yeah, and thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for collating these, and I appreciate it. And more to come soon.